There's just so much in this chapter, and increasingly as we go through John's Gospel, we're just selecting certain parts of it for these reflections. But I wanted to reflect particularly on this conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus. These things that Jesus said need to be seen in the context in which they were given, this conversation with Nicodemus. He comes to Jesus at night, secretly engaging over theology, not to trap Jesus like in other situations that Jesus finds himself in, but he's there to try and understand Jesus and understand his teaching. To his inquiring mind, Jesus gives this amazing insight into the God who Nicodemus worships, but yet doesn't seem to know or recognize. How easily could that be described of many of us in the church these days, that we worship God, but how well do we know him? Nicodemus was a member of the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin. He was seriously high up in Jewish society. He was a Pharisee, which meant he was incredibly well educated, well versed in the scriptures. He was highly qualified. He was an expert politician and an expert theologian. Indeed, Jesus, referring to him later on as the teacher of Israel in verse 10, seems to suggest he was perhaps one of the top theologians in his day. He was from a well-to-do family. He would have had to have been to be in the Sanhedrin. This guy was in a good position. He really knew his stuff. But he can't get his head around Jesus. And then, as he kind of explains this, Jesus stumps him even more by saying something which I've seen so many times on placards and posters and banners, particularly in Northern Ireland. There's a cultural thing which is on country roads in Northern Ireland. There's often these gospel billboards, and often it'll be in King James English, "Ye must be born again." Very subtle, I suppose. And we know this phrase, being born again, being a born again Christian, used in some minds it's used to mean sandals and socks, cheesy smiles, and a rainbow guitar strap. And of course we know that's true. But this phrase flummoxes Nicodemus. His cultural, spiritual context is that what makes you part of God's kingdom, part of God's family, was to do with being born into the Jewish nation, the Jewish tradition. And his was an impeccable list of qualifications, and yet Jesus seems to suggest that he and others need to be born again. The word, in fact, the word born again, or the phrase that's used, the word again can also mean born from above, and both meanings are actually needed. When we say born again, it's talking about our experience. We need to have an experience of regeneration, from death to the old life, and a birth to the new life by believing in Jesus. But the important thing as well is to think of being born from above. It's important because it shows the origins of this new life. It's not just about spiritual illumination or some kind of achievement or even racial inheritance. It is all sourced in God. It's all his initiative. And Jesus goes on to talk about two symbols. He talks about water and he talks about wind. He says water, it kind of symbolizes our experience, our rejection of the old life. It's the picture of baptism and being born into new life. It symbolizes our experience. But the wind that Jesus talks about, it symbolizes the mysterious movement of God's Spirit. In fact, in Greek and Hebrew, the same word is used for wind as it is for spirit. Being born into God's family. Being born into God's family again takes us back to chapter 1, as so much does. Goes back to the prologue in John. Chapter 1, verses 12 and 13. It says, we are born from God. He gives us the right to become his children. There's no reliance on breeding or background or achievement or act on our part. It all comes from and originates with the Father heart of God. And a genuine rebirth from above, a rebirth from God, a born againness must make a difference, in the same way that when the wind blows, its impact and influence is felt. And for Nicodemus, in his neatly ordered, highly systematized set of beliefs, like a tidily sorted stack of categorized papers, they're blown all over the place by the wind of the Spirit. And it's completely confusing him. He's completely flummoxed. He can't get his head around it. Jesus then talks about this idea of being lifted up, and he refers to an episode in Numbers 21, 5 and 8, where snakes are coming to the camp of the people of Israel and poison people who've been disobedient. And in order to save people, a bronze snake on a pole is lifted up, and if people look at it, they were cured and saved. And Jesus refers to it, he talks about himself being lifted up, when the Son of Man is lifted up. And it's a foreshadowing of the cross. And that leads us to the reason and intention behind this whole rescue mission. And we come to the golden verse, John 3:16. For God loved the world so much that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not die but have eternal life. You see, verse 16, it's that glory verse. It's the one people know. It's the poster headline of Jesus' sayings. And perhaps with so many biblical stories, events and verses, we can become so accustomed to them that they lose something of their power. And I think what could help with this is looking at both verse 16 and verse 17. The first thing that we discover in God loved the world, the first thing is the source of what Jesus is doing. It is fueled utterly and completely by God's love for us. And the extent of this love is demonstrated by the giving up of his only Son, and not just to the cross, but in him coming among us at all, the incarnation, God with us. Back to 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. Grace, another picture of God's love. But there's something we also need to notice, something significant in both these verses, in verse 16 and verse 17. Verse 17 says, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. And often if a word is repeated in a passage, especially in close proximity, it's there for a reason. So it says, take notice. And there's a word which is repeated 4 times in these 2 verses, and that word is the word world. God loved the world. He sent his Son into the world. He is not condemning the world. He's there to save the world. Now remember, the whole thing about being born into God's kingdom was presumed to mean that you were born as a Jew into one of the 12 tribes of Israel, that kind of thing. And Nicodemus typifies this pinnacle of racial inheritance. But Jesus blows that message apart. He blows it wide open. He is here for everyone. Everyone can be born into God's kingdom. His family is not through a race or a religion. It's through a relationship of love from God to every one of his broken and fallen creation, Jew or Gentile. That's why John 3:17, I think, is just as important as John 3:16. The Son didn't come to the world to condemn it, but to save it. How often has the church and individual Christians been described as being judgmental and being condemnatory? But Jesus, he knows that the world, the sinful humanity, has rebelled and rejected God. It's the current state of play. Jesus can't be fooled. But Jesus is not here to gloat judgmentally and to make people feel worse. He has come to be the solution, not just to remind us that there is a problem. And this is for the whole world, not just for the Jewish nation. And back to chapter 1, verse 12, to all who believed him, he gave the right to be children of God, to be born again, to be born from above. And this is the ultimate rescue mission. There is, of course, the follow-on from this verse. People need to be aware that they need saving in order to be saved. Therefore, Jesus can say that whoever believes in him is not condemned, but those who don't stand condemned. It's like people sitting on a roof of a house during a flood as the waters continue to rise, and someone comes along with an offer to save them, to rescue them. And some look around and realise they need saving and they take the rescuer's hand. But many look around and don't think they need saving, think it'll be okay in the end. And they therefore don't accept the offer of rescue, and subsequently the waters keep rising. Even when Jesus, the light, is revealed, remember, light and life are a couple of key things in John's Gospel. Even when Jesus appears, he is the light of the world, and it's easier to stay hidden in the dark often, not to have sins exposed or even admitted to. Perhaps it's one of the reasons why it's hard for people to come to Jesus. It is exposing. It's reminding us that we are fallen. But it's that very exposing of our sinfulness and fallenness is the water part of the new life. It's our part that needs to be played. And the next bit is the mysterious bit. It's the bit of the wind of the Spirit, the stuff that Jesus does within us. This meeting of Jesus and Nicodemus is a crucial encounter. Again, showing the old way being shattered by the new wine, the new worship, the new life that can only come through God's one and only Son, in whom anyone who believes is not condemned, but is saved to eternal life.